1. The Indus Valley Civilization, Harappa, the death of a river. Imagine stepping into a sprawling, sun-baked metropolis 4,500 years ago and finding a grid of perfectly aligned, kiln-fired brick streets. Flanking these avenues are multi-story houses equipped with private bathrooms and indoor plumbing that includes flush toilets. Beneath the streets, a network of covered sewers carries wastewater away with an engineering precision that would not be seen again until the height of the Roman Empire. This is not an alternate history. This is Mohenjo-Daro, the beating urban heart of the Indus Valley civilization. Stretching across over 1 million square kilometers of modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India, this was a true superpower of the ancient world. At its zenith, it commanded a population of up to 5 million people, vastly dwarfing its famous contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Yet, among all ancient superpowers, the Indus people were a bizarre anomaly. In a brutal Bronze Age world defined by relentless conquest and blood, the Indus Valley left behind zero evidence of standing armies. Archaeological excavations have unearthed tens of thousands of artifacts, yet virtually no weapons of war. There are no grand stone monuments glorifying tyrannical god kings, no murals depicting the slaughter of captive slaves, and no massive fortified walls designed to repel foreign invasions. Instead, this society worshipped standardization and commerce. They traded across dangerous oceans, utilized a system of standard weights and measures so incredibly precise it baffles modern historians, and engineered an urban water management system that treated sanitation as a fundamental right. And then, at the height of their brilliance, they simply vanished. By 1900 BCE, this sprawling, peaceful utopia began to rapidly decay. The great municipal baths dried up. The meticulously planned streets were encroached upon by crude, haphazardly built dwellings. The once pristine drainage systems choked on refuse and silt. Finally, the megacities were abandoned entirely, left to the relentless mercy of the desert wind. Their writing system, neatly stamped onto thousands of steatite seals, remains a locked code to this day. They left no final message, no desperate warning, and no explanation. For decades, early historians blamed a phantom invasion of Aryan nomads sweeping down from the mountains. But the Earth itself tells a different, far more terrifying story. The executioner of the Indus Valley civilization was not a foreign army, it was the planet Earth itself. To understand their sudden demise, we must look at the geological and atmospheric heartbeat of the region. The Indus cities were built upon a highly precarious ecological foundation, completely reliant on two immense natural forces: the predictable summer monsoon and a sprawling network of glacier-fed rivers plunging from the Himalayas. Among these was the mythical Saraswati River, a mighty roaring waterway described in ancient Vedic texts as rushing from the high mountains directly into the Arabian Sea. For centuries, modern scholars dismissed this river as pure mythological fiction. Modern satellite imagery and deep penetrating radar, however, have mapped its ghost, a massive, dry paleochannel hiding deep beneath the shifting sands of the Thar Desert. The destruction of the Indus Valley was a devastating geological one-two punch. First came the violent shifting of tectonic plates. The Indian subcontinent is a restless, heavy chunk of continental crust, perpetually smashing upward into the Eurasian plate to forge the Himalayas. Deep beneath the feet of the Indus people, immense kinetic stress had been building along invisible fault lines. Around 3,900 years ago, that stress snapped. Catastrophic earthquakes ripped through the river valleys. The tremors were not just destructive to brick buildings, they fundamentally warped the actual topography of the continent. The land physically tilted. This massive seismic uplift triggered a terrifying geographic phenomenon known as river avulsion. The main tributaries that fed the great Saraswati River were literally thrown out of their carved valleys. The powerful Sutlej River was violently shifted westward to join the Indus, while the Yamuna River snapped eastward to merge with the Ganges. Suddenly, the primary life-giving artery of the Indus Valley civilization was decapitated. Stripped of its glacial meltwater from the high peaks, the once roaring Saraswati was immediately reduced to a sluggish, dying stream. But the Earth was not finished. Just as tectonic uplift strangled the rivers from below, a global climate catastrophe struck from above. Paleoclimatologists refer to this as the 4.2 kilo-year event, a severe, planet-wide megadrought that brought empires from the Mediterranean to the Yellow River to their knees. In the Indus Valley, this abrupt climate shift drastically altered atmospheric pressure zones, killing the summer monsoons. The predictable torrential rains, which had naturally watered their vast agricultural hinterlands for 1,000 years, simply stopped coming. The combination was a definitive death sentence. The mighty Saraswati dried up completely, leaving behind a scarred, barren landscape that would quickly transform into the hyper-arid Thar Desert we know today. The complex plumbing and grand reservoirs of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, once a marvel of human engineering, became totally useless in a world without flowing water. Urban centers of this massive magnitude require continuous, immense agricultural surpluses to survive. When the floodplains baked into cracked mud, the crops failed year after agonizing year, famine set in. Disease inevitably followed. The societal order, built entirely on complex trade and cooperation rather than military force, collapsed under the unbearable weight of mass starvation. The people of the Indus Valley did not all die at once, nor were they slaughtered by bronze swords. They were starved out by a shifting, indifferent planet. Over the span of a few desperate generations, they packed whatever they could carry and embarked on a massive exodus eastward, migrating toward the more humid and stable Ganges basin. In doing so, they left behind their great cities, their undeciphered written language, and their advanced engineering. They dispersed into small, scattered rural villages, eventually losing the urban greatness of their ancestors. The earth had swallowed their rivers, and the sands of time swallowed their memory, hiding them away in the dark for more than 3,000 years. 2. The Sangjingdui Empire. The mass burial event. Deep beneath the fertile, mist-shrouded soils of the Sichuan Basin in southwestern China lies a mystery that has completely rewritten the history of the ancient world. When archaeologists first unearthed the remnants of the Sanxingdui civilization, they were greeted by faces that looked entirely unearthly. Colossal bronze masks with bulging, cylindrical eyes, exaggerated, flaring ears, and strange, eerie grins stared back at them from the dark dirt. Along with these bizarre masks was a massive, 4-meter-tall bronze tree of life intricately covered in cast bronze birds, dragons, and sacred fruit, showcasing a level of metallurgical sophistication that rivaled and, in many ways, surpassed any other civilization on the planet at the time. This was a glittering, enormously wealthy empire that thrived around 3,200 years ago. Yet, remarkably, there is not a single mention of them in any ancient Chinese historical texts. They were a ghost empire, flourishing in total isolation behind the towering, impenetrable mountains of Sichuan, existing parallel to the famous Shang dynasty but remaining entirely unknown to them. But the most baffling aspect of the Sansingdui civilization is not how they lived, but how they abruptly died. Around 1200 BCE, this highly advanced, deeply religious society committed an act of sudden, systematic cultural suicide. They did not slowly decline. They did not fall to a conquering army. There are no signs of battle, no mass graves of slaughtered warriors, and no burned fortifications. Instead, the people of Sanxingdui meticulously gathered their most sacred, irreplaceable treasures, thousands of ornate bronze statues, priceless jade blades, gold foils, and tons of elephant tusks. They intentionally and violently smashed them to pieces. They set them on fire, burning them in massive infernos, and then carefully, methodically buried the scorched, broken remains in deep, rectangular sacrificial pits. After sealing the pits with layers of rammed earth, the entire population turned their backs on their grand, bustling capital and walked away forever, leaving no trace of where they went. For decades, this bizarre mass burial was attributed to an invading force or a violent internal revolution. But why would a conquering invader bury priceless treasure instead of looting it? And why take the time to layer the broken artifacts so perfectly? The answer lies not in human conflict, but in the violent, restless geology of the Sichuan Basin. Sansingdui was built on the absolute edge of the Longminshan Fault Zone, one of the most dangerous and seismically active tectonic boundaries on Earth. This is the exact same geological fault line responsible for the catastrophic 2008 Wenchuan earthquake. Here, the unstoppable eastward movement of the massive Tibetan Plateau violently collides with the rigid, unyielding rock of the Yangtze Craton. 3,000 years ago, the unimaginable tectonic stress along this grinding continental crust reached a breaking point. Geological evidence and sedimentary records suggest a monstrous earthquake ripped through the region. The sheer violence of the tremors would have been terrifying, shaking the monumental bronze statues to the ground, fracturing city walls, and collapsing their intricate infrastructure. But the earthquake was only the beginning of a terrifying sequence of natural disasters. In the steep, mountainous terrain surrounding the basin, the massive seismic shockwave triggered colossal landslides. Millions of tons of rock, timber, and soil cascaded into the winding gorges of the ancient Minjiang River, effectively building a massive, highly unstable natural dam. Behind this sudden wall of debris, a gigantic reservoir of water rapidly began to build up, cutting off the vital water supply to the Sangxingdui metropolis downstream. For a brief, agonizing period, the city would have faced sudden, inexplicable drought. The powerful river they relied on for agriculture and transport simply vanished into a muddy trickle. But the true catastrophe was waiting in the mountains. When the immense pressure of the pent-up river finally breached the fragile landslide dam, it unleashed a catastrophic megaflood. A towering wall of water, mud, and pulverized rock roared down the canyon, completely reshaping the valley's topography. The raging torrent violently shifted the course of the river entirely, moving it miles away from the city's walls and permanently destroying their intricate network of irrigation canals. To the deeply spiritual people of Sansingdui, this sequence of apocalyptic events, the violent, roaring shaking of the earth, the unnatural disappearance of the river, and the subsequent devastating flood, would have been interpreted as the ultimate wrath of the gods. The earth and water deities they worshipped had suddenly, violently turned against them. In a desperate, final attempt to appease these furious natural forces, the elite priests of Sansingdui organized a massive, citywide ritual. They sacrificed their most valuable possessions, the very core of their cultural identity. They broke their sacred bronzes to release their spiritual power, burned them to send them to the heavens, and buried them deep within the earth to calm the trembling ground. When the fires burned out and the gods remained silent, there was nothing left to do. Their agricultural foundation was permanently destroyed. Their river had abandoned them, and their city was ruined. The entire civilization packed up and migrated away from the cursed land, likely assimilating into neighboring cultures and slowly losing their unique identity. The magnificent, eerie bronze faces were left in the dark, buried under the mud of a changing planet, waiting over 3 millennia to see the light of day again. 3. The Kingdom of Tartessos, the victim of the ocean's wrath. For over 2 millennia, the specter of Atlantis has haunted Western mythology, a glittering, hyper-advanced maritime empire swallowed in a single day and night of misfortune. Most modern historians dismiss the legend as a philosophical allegory invented by Plato. But what if the famous philosopher was actually drawing inspiration from a very real, very catastrophic geological event? To find the origin of this myth, we must travel to the southwestern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, to the modern-day region of Andalusia, Spain. Here, 3,000 years ago, stood the kingdom of Tartessos, a civilization so blindingly wealthy it became the stuff of ancient legend. Tartessos was the undisputed metallurgical superpower of the ancient Mediterranean. Flourishing between the 9th and 6th centuries BCE, this kingdom sat upon a geological gold mine, the Iberian Pyrite Belt. This massive crescent of volcanic rock held staggering, easily accessible deposits of silver, gold, copper, and tin. The Tartessians mastered the art of smelting, transforming these ores into immense wealth. They built bustling, deep-water port cities at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, trading massive quantities of precious metals with daring Phoenician and Greek merchants. In classical texts, Tartessos is described as a land of unimaginable riches, ruled by a king named Arganthonios, the man of silver, who supposedly lived for 120 years. And then, just like the mythological Atlantis, it abruptly ceased to exist. By 500 BCE, Tartessos disappeared entirely from the historical record. When later Roman and Greek geographers traveled to the Iberian coast to find the fabled silver cities, they found nothing. There were no grand ruins to marvel at, no conquered populations to tax, and no stories of a mighty invasion. It was as if the kingdom had been completely erased from the surface of the earth. For centuries, the disappearance of Tartessos was an unsolvable historical cold case, but recently a team of geologists and earth scientists turned their attention to the Doñana National Park, a vast, sprawling marshland that now sits where the ancient Tartessian estuary once flowed into the Atlantic Ocean. By drilling deep into the mud and extracting sedimentary core samples, they uncovered a terrifying, chaotic layer of stratigraphy hiding just beneath the tranquil surface. Miles inland from the current coastline, scientists found a distinct high-energy layer of coarse marine sand, crushed seashells, and jumbled boulders sandwiched violently between layers of calm terrestrial river clay. In geological terms, this is a distinct signature of a cataclysmic, sudden marine intrusion. It is the footprint of a mega tsunami. The kingdom of Tartessos was sitting directly in the crosshairs of a geological time bomb, the Azores-Gibraltar Transform Fault. This highly volatile tectonic boundary is where the massive African plate grinds relentlessly against the Eurasian plate. It is a subduction zone notorious for producing extreme, deep-sea seismic events, most notably the apocalyptic 1755 Lisbon earthquake that devastated Portugal. Sometime in the 6th century BCE, the immense kinetic energy locked within this fault line abruptly snapped. The nightmare began with a massive megathrust earthquake, likely exceeding an 8.5 on the Richter scale. The initial tremors would have shattered the grand stone buildings and smelting furnaces of Tartessos. But the shaking triggered a secondary, far more insidious phenomenon known as tectonic subsidence. The entire coastal plain physically dropped in elevation, plunging the low-lying river estuary closer to sea level in a matter of minutes. Then, the ocean pulled back. The water in the Gulf of Cadiz rapidly receded, exposing miles of the muddy seafloor. When the ocean returned, it was not as a tide, but as an unstoppable, towering wall of kinetic energy. A mega tsunami, potentially reaching heights of 10 to 15 meters, roared toward the Spanish coast. Because Tartessos was situated in a wide river estuary, the geography of the land acted like a massive funnel. As the wave entered the narrowing mouth of the river, the water was forced upward and inward, violently amplifying its height and destructive power. The tsunami slammed into the Tartessian ports with unimaginable fury. It obliterated their grand merchant fleets, crushed their harbor defenses, and swept entirely over their coastal cities. The surging saltwater rushed miles inland, tearing up the earth, ripping trees from their roots, and annihilating the region's agricultural infrastructure. But the true death blow was what the ocean left behind. As the massive wave lost its momentum and the waters slowly receded, it deposited millions of tons of oceanic sand, thick clay, and suffocating mud across the entire kingdom. The vital Guadalquivir River estuary, the very economic artery that connected Tartessos to the Mediterranean world, was completely choked with debris. In a single, horrifying day, the geography of southwestern Spain was permanently altered. The deep, navigable harbors were transformed into shallow, impassable, and malaria-ridden swamps, their economy destroyed, their cities buried under feet of thick, anaerobic mud. The survivors had no choice but to scatter into the Iberian interior. The kingdom of Tartessos was swallowed by the ocean and sealed in the earth, leaving behind nothing but a fading memory that would eventually morph into the greatest myth in human history. 4. The Minoan civilization, the destruction from the Earth's core. Long before the classical Greek philosophers debated in Athens, and long before Rome was even a thought, the Mediterranean Sea belonged to the Minoans. Flourishing on the island of Crete around 2000 BCE, they were Europe's first true maritime superpower. Their civilization was a vibrant explosion of color, art, and architectural genius. They built the sprawling multi-story Palace of Knossos, a labyrinthine complex boasting over 1,000 rooms, flushing toilets, and walls adorned with breathtaking frescoes of leaping dolphins and athletic bull riders. Uniquely for the brutal Bronze Age, Minoan cities lacked heavy defensive walls. They didn't need them. Their absolute mastery of shipbuilding and navigation gave them a monopoly on Mediterranean trade, acting as a supreme naval shield. For centuries, they reigned in a golden age of peace and prosperity, recording their transactions in an enigmatic, still undeciphered script known as Linear A. But by 1450 BCE, this brilliant sun-drenched thalassocracy violently collapsed. Their palaces burned, their great fleets disappeared, and their culture was rapidly absorbed by the warlike Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland. The Minoans were not brought down by superior military strategy. They were obliterated by the unimaginable fury of the Earth's mantle. The island of Crete and the surrounding Aegean Sea sits directly atop the Hellenic subduction zone. Here, the massive African tectonic plate is relentlessly plunging beneath the smaller Aegean Sea plate. As the African plate sinks deep into the Earth's superheated mantle, it melts, generating colossal plumes of highly pressurized magma that rise toward the surface. This tectonic meat grinder created a volcanic arc, and right in the center of it lay a beautiful circular island called Thera, known today as Santorini. The Minoans had built a thriving trading outpost on Thera, unaware that they were living on the roof of a supervolcano. Deep beneath the island, a massive magma chamber had been accumulating thousands of cubic kilometers of molten rock and expanding volcanic gases. The pressure was building to an unsustainable, world-breaking threshold. Sometime around 1600 BCE, the roof blew off. The eruption of Thera was one of the most violent and catastrophic geological events in recorded human history, registering as a staggering 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, VEI. The blast was estimated to be 4 to 5 times more powerful than the famous 1883 eruption of Krakatoa. The initial explosion ripped the island apart, ejecting an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of pulverized rock, pumice, and ash into the atmosphere. A roaring, superheated column of volcanic debris blasted over 35 kilometers high, piercing the stratosphere. The sound of the explosion was so deafening it would have ruptured the eardrums of anyone within miles, and the shockwave rippled across the entire globe. But the sky was only half the threat. As the colossal magma chamber beneath the island rapidly emptied, the structural integrity of the earth above it failed. The center of Thera collapsed in on itself, plunging billions of tons of rock into the boiling sea. This sudden, massive displacement of ocean water triggered a nightmare sequence of mega tsunamis. Crete was only 110 kilometers south of Thera. The Minoans looking out from their northern coastal cities would have seen the horizon itself rising. A wall of water estimated by modern geologists to be anywhere from 30 to 50 meters high raced across the open ocean at the speed of a jet airliner. The tsunami slammed into the northern coast of Crete with apocalyptic force. It instantly pulverized the Minoan merchant and naval fleets anchored in the harbors, the very lifeblood of their empire and their only line of defense. The surging salt water rushed violently inland, destroying shipyards, coastal settlements, and crucial agricultural plains. As if the tsunamis were not enough, the fallout from the sky sealed their fate. The stratospheric ash cloud blotted out the sun, plunging the eastern Mediterranean into a localized volcanic winter. Blankets of toxic, heavy volcanic ash rained down across the Aegean, suffocating the surviving crops on Crete and poisoning the freshwater supplies. With their agriculture choked by sulfur and ash, and their maritime economy completely annihilated by the ocean, the Minoan infrastructure collapsed entirely. The surviving population, starving, traumatized, and stripped of their naval supremacy, fell into deep societal disarray. Their once great palaces fell into ruin, and their power vacuum was quickly noticed. Within a few generations, the opportunistic Mycenaeans sailed across the sea, easily conquering the weakened remnants of a civilization that had already been shattered by the center of the earth. 5. The Olmec, when Mother Nature changed the river's course. Deep within the sweltering, mosquito-choked jungles of Mexico's Gulf Coast lies the burial ground of Mesoamerica's mother culture. Nearly 3,000 years ago, long before the Maya raised their stepped pyramids or the Aztecs built their floating capital, the Olmec civilization laid the foundation for virtually every great empire that would follow in Central America. They were the original architects of the Mesoamerican cosmos. They invented the ritualistic rubber ball game, developed an intricate calendar system, and were the first in the Western Hemisphere to understand the concept of zero. But their most awe-inspiring legacy is written in stone. The Olmec carved colossal, terrifyingly realistic human heads from solid volcanic basalt. Some of these monolithic sculptures stand over 3 meters tall and weigh up to 40 tons. Yet, the Olmec possessed no beasts of burden, no iron tools, and absolutely no knowledge of the wheel. To transport these massive stones from the Tuxtla Mountains to their great religious centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, a journey of nearly 100 kilometers across treacherous swamps and dense rainforests, required a society with staggering logistical organization and engineering genius. For centuries, they were the undisputed lords of the jungle, and then, around 400 BCE, the heart of the Olmec world simply stopped beating. Their great ceremonial capitals were methodically abandoned. The massive, frowning stone heads were ritually buried or deliberately defaced, and the once bustling plazas were surrendered to the encroaching vines and roots of the rainforest. There is no archaeological evidence of a great Mesoamerican world war, no mass graves, and no signs that a foreign invader put their cities to the torch. The Olmec simply dissolved into the shadows of the jungle. The mystery of their disappearance puzzled archaeologists for decades, primarily because they were looking for a human culprit. To understand the death of the Olmec, one must understand the fragile, incredibly dynamic ecosystem they built their empire upon. The Olmec were an amphibious civilization. They did not conquer the jungle by cutting it down. They mastered the water. Their great cities were intentionally built on naturally elevated ridges within vast, sprawling river deltas, particularly the Coatzacoalcos River Basin. These winding waterways were the undisputed arteries of their empire. The rivers provided a massive, interconnected superhighway for trading exotic jade and obsidian, and they served as the hydraulic conveyor belts used to raft their colossal basalt stones down from the mountains. More importantly, the annual flooding of these rivers deposited rich, nutrient-dense silt along the banks, creating highly fertile levees that allowed the Olmec to grow massive surpluses of maize to feed their growing population. But living in a river delta means living at the absolute mercy of geology, and the Earth's crust in this region is notoriously restless. The Gulf Coast of Mexico sits geographically close to the grinding tectonic convergence, where the Cocos Plate subducts relentlessly beneath the North American plate. This immense tectonic friction fuels the volcanic activity of the nearby Tuxtla Mountains and subjects the surrounding coastal plains to frequent seismic tremors and subtle yet highly destructive topological shifts. Around the time of the Olmec collapse, the ground beneath their feet began to betray them. Geological surveys and soil core analysis suggest that the region experienced a slow but catastrophic period of tectonic uplift. As the subterranean bedrock shifted and bowed, the physical gradient of the land was permanently altered. For an amphibious empire reliant on precise water flow, a change in land elevation is a death sentence. As the coastal plain tilted, the flow of the great rivers began to drastically slow down. Stripped of their kinetic energy, the sluggish rivers could no longer carry their heavy loads of sediment. Massive amounts of silt and mud began to rapidly drop to the riverbeds, choking the estuaries and severely silting up the waterways. Faced with blocked, shallow channels, the rivers did what water always does. They aggressively sought a new path of least resistance. In a geological process known as river avulsion, the mighty waterways violently changed their courses, carving new channels miles away from the established Olmec centers. The ecological strangulation was absolute. The intricate network of navigable trade routes, the lifeblood of their economy, was instantly reduced to impassable, stagnant swamps. The fertile, flood-replenished levees their farmers depended on dried out, causing catastrophic agricultural failure. And without the deep, flowing rivers, the transport of their sacred basalt megaliths became physically impossible. The Olmec were not slaughtered by a rival tribe, nor did they face a sudden fiery apocalypse. They were starved out and stranded by a changing planet. As their ecosystem choked on mud and their agricultural surplus vanished, the immense social cohesion required to maintain their civilization fractured. Over a few desperate generations, they simply packed up and dispersed deeper into the continent, carrying the seeds of their advanced culture to the nascent Maya. The colossal stone heads were left behind in the mud, sinking slowly into the earth as Mother Nature reclaimed the rivers that had once made them gods. 6. The Kingdom of Nabatea, the last drop in the desert, hidden deep within the sun-scorched, jagged mountains of southern Jordan, lies a city that seems to defy the very laws of nature. Carved directly into the sheer rose-red sandstone cliffs is Petra, the glittering capital of the Nabatean kingdom. 2,000 years ago, the Nabateans were the undisputed lords of the Arabian desert. They controlled the highly lucrative incense trade routes, moving priceless shipments of frankincense, myrrh, and rare spices from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean ports. But the true genius of the Nabateans was not their mastery of commerce, nor their breathtaking monolithic architecture. Their ultimate weapon was water. They built a thriving metropolis of nearly 30,000 people in one of the most arid, unforgiving environments on Earth, a landscape that receives a mere handful of inches of rain per year. How? The Nabateans were arguably the greatest hydro-engineers of the ancient world. They understood the brutal mechanics of the desert. When rain does fall in this barren terrain, it does not soak into the baked earth. It violently sheets off the impermeable rock, creating deadly, roaring flash floods that tear through the narrow slot canyons. Instead of fighting this chaotic water, the Nabateans captured it. They terraformed their entire environment, building a staggering, invisible network of catchment basins, rock-cut cisterns, and hidden subterranean ceramic pipes that spanned hundreds of miles. They constructed massive dams to redirect violent floodwaters away from the city center and channeled every precious drop into a highly pressurized urban plumbing system. They possessed so much stored water in the middle of a wasteland that they built lush, public gardens and massive swimming pools to flaunt their wealth to exhausted, dust-choked caravans. And yet, today, Petra is a silent, wind-scoured ruin. By the early Islamic period, the Nabatean society had vanished entirely, leaving their rose-red city to be swallowed by the desert sands, forgotten by the outside world until it was accidentally rediscovered by a Swiss explorer in the 19th century. Historical texts often point to the Roman annexation of Nabatea in 106 CE, or the shifting of global maritime trade routes, as the cause of their decline. While economic shifts certainly weaken them, empires do not simply abandon their ancestral, impenetrable fortresses due to a drop in profit margins. The true executioner of the Nabateans was the violent geological heartbeat of the Levant. Petra was unknowingly constructed directly atop a geological powder keg, the Dead Sea Transform. This is a massive, highly active continental strike-slip fault system where the enormous Arabian tectonic plate is relentlessly grinding northward past the African plate. This continuous, violent friction deep beneath the Earth's crust periodically locks up, building unimaginable amounts of kinetic energy. On the morning of May 18th, 363 CE, the Earth beneath Petra violently tore itself apart. A cataclysmic earthquake, estimated by modern paleoseismologists to be a magnitude 7 or higher, ripped through the region. The sheer violence of the tremors was devastating. The grand, freestanding temples, the bustling marketplaces, and the colonnaded streets of the city center were instantly flattened, burying thousands beneath tons of collapsing stone. But in a desert metropolis, collapsed buildings are merely a tragedy. Shattered plumbing is an absolute apocalypse. The earthquake dealt a fatal, irreversible blow to the Nabateans' delicate life support system. The violent seismic shockwaves cracked the solid bedrock itself, rupturing the heavily engineered subterranean cisterns that held millions of gallons of stored water. In minutes, the city's vital reservoirs bled out into the deep earth. The intricate network of ceramic pipes, painstakingly laid at precise gradients to ensure continuous gravity-fed flow, was snapped, crushed, and violently misaligned by the shifting ground. The massive diversion dams that protected the city from flash floods were critically fractured. When the shaking finally stopped, the survivors found themselves trapped in a terrifying new reality. Their architectural masterpiece was in ruins, but far worse, they were completely stripped of their water. The technological marvel that had allowed them to cheat the desert for centuries was broken beyond repair. The highly specialized, generational knowledge required to maintain and perfectly calibrate the sprawling hydraulic network was useless in the face of such profound geographical deformation, and the sheer scale of the destruction made reconstruction physically impossible. Without their engineered water supply, Petra immediately reverted to what it naturally was, an uninhabitable, bone-dry canyon. The desert, which the Nabateans had so brilliantly held at bay, rushed back in to reclaim its territory. A city of thousands cannot survive in a barren wasteland without a drop to drink. Forced to choose between death by dehydration or immediate abandonment, the surviving Nabateans packed up whatever they could salvage and fled. They dispersed into the surrounding nomadic tribes, leaving their spectacular rock-cut tombs to the mercy of the wind. The last drop of water vanished into the fractured earth, and the undisputed masters of the desert vanished with it. 7. The Norte Chico civilization, Corral, the attack of El Niño. 5,000 years ago, long before the Inca carved their towering empire into the Andes, and long before the Maya mapped the stars, the dawn of human civilization in the Americas was already blazing to life on the desolate, windswept coast of Peru. This was the Norte Chico civilization, also known as Corral Supe. Thriving around 3000 BCE, they were exact contemporaries of the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia and the architects of the early Egyptian pyramids. Yet, among the pantheon of the world's oldest empires, Norte Chico is an absolute baffling anomaly. They constructed colossal stone pyramids, massive sunken circular plazas, and sprawling urban centers spread across 30 different sites. But they did this without the hallmark technologies we assume are required to build a complex society. They had no ceramics to store food. They possessed no complex visual art or murals. They had no system of writing. Most shockingly, just like the Indus Valley civilization, they had absolutely no weapons of war. There are no defensive walls, no battlements, and no evidence of human conflict. Instead, Norte Chico was an empire built entirely on a flawless, peaceful, and highly synchronized ecological loop. They survived by perfectly exploiting two extreme environments. Inland, along the narrow, fertile river valleys cutting through the hyper-arid desert, farmers used advanced irrigation to grow massive quantities of cotton and squash. On the rocky, barren coast, fishermen harvested the incredibly rich Pacific waters, pulling millions of anchovies from the cold ocean. The inland farmers traded their cotton to the coastal fishermen who used it to weave massive fishing nets. The fishermen, in turn, traded dried fish inland to feed the pyramid builders. It was a perfect symbiotic engine of survival. Then, around 1800 BCE, the engine abruptly stalled. Over a startlingly brief period, the Great Pyramids were completely abandoned. The sprawling plazas were left empty. The meticulously engineered irrigation canals dried out. The population vanished, leaving no trace of violence, no evidence of a foreign invasion, and no clues as to where they went. To understand how the oldest civilization in the Americas died, we have to look off the coast and deep underground. The Norte Chico were the victims of a highly complex, devastating chain reaction triggered by the Earth's geology and amplified by the planet's climate. The Peruvian coast is a geological battlefield. It sits directly atop the Peru-Chile Trench, a massive subduction zone where the oceanic Nazca Plate is violently plunging beneath the continental South American plate. This immense tectonic collision is actively pushing up the towering Andes Mountains, making the region incredibly prone to monstrous earthquakes. Around 3,800 years ago, a massive, seismic event, likely a magnitude 8.0 or higher, ripped through the Supi Valley. The earthquake shattered the Norte Chico cities, bringing heavy stone walls crashing down, but collapsed buildings could be rebuilt. The true danger lay high above them. The intense seismic shockwaves heavily fractured the steep, rocky slopes of the Andean foothills surrounding the river valleys. Millions of tons of loosened rock, gravel, and dirt sheared away, hanging precariously over the valleys, held back only by friction. Then came the climate monster, the El Niño Southern Oscillation. Normally, The Peruvian coast is one of the driest deserts on the planet, but periodically, anomalous warming of the Pacific Ocean drastically alters global weather patterns, unleashing localized apocalyptic rainfall. Geological records indicate that shortly after the massive earthquake, the region was slammed by an extreme mega El Nino event. Torrential, relentless rains pounded the hyper-arid landscape. As millions of gallons of water hit the earthquake-loosened debris in the mountains, it triggered colossal mudslides, known locally as huaicos. A terrifying slurry of mud, boulders, and pulverized earth roared down the Supi River Valley, violently ripping through the Norte Chico's agricultural fields and completely destroying their delicate irrigation networks. But the devastation did not stop at the riverbanks. The colossal volume of mud and debris was flushed directly into the Pacific Ocean. When millions of tons of sediment violently slammed into the shallow coastal bays, it triggered an ecological collapse. The pristine, nutrient-rich coastal waters were instantly choked with thick, impenetrable mud. The anchovies, the absolute bedrock of the Norte Chico food supply, either died off in mass or migrated to deeper, clearer waters. Overnight, the coastal fishing economy was utterly annihilated. Yet, the Earth still had one final fatal blow to deliver. As the massive piles of river sediment dried along the coastline, the relentless, powerful onshore winds of the Pacific picked up the sand. The wind pushed this newly deposited coastal debris back inland, creating massive migrating sand dunes. Like a slow-motion geological tsunami, these towering dunes marched relentlessly across the desert plain. They swallowed the ruined irrigation canals, buried the remaining agricultural fields, and literally engulfed the great stone pyramids of Corral. The perfect symbiotic loop was severed from both sides. The sea offered no fish, and the land offered no crops. Facing absolute starvation and literally buried alive by a sea of sand, the surviving population had no choice but to permanently abandon the cradle of American civilization, scattering into the high Andes and the Amazon basin to start over. 8. The Aksumite Empire. When the trees disappear, the empire collapses. In the 3rd century CE, the prominent Persian philosopher and prophet Mani surveyed the known world and recorded a startling observation. He declared that there were only 4 absolute superpowers on the face of the earth: the mighty Roman Empire, the sprawling Persian Empire, the vast dynasties of China, and the kingdom of Aksum. Today, while Rome and China are universally recognized, Aksum is often met with blank stares. Yet, 2,000 years ago, this glittering African metropolis, located in the rugged highlands of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, held the world's economy in the palm of its hand. Aksum was a true titan of the ancient world. They completely dominated the treacherous waters of the Red Sea, acting as the unavoidable, wealthy tollgate between the Roman Empire and the exotic riches of the Indian subcontinent. Their capital city was a marvel of engineering, boasting palatial estates, complex underground catacombs, and most famously, the massive stelae. These towering, monolithic obelisks, carved from single solid blocks of dense granite weighing up to 500 tons, were meticulously chiseled to resemble multi-story skyscrapers, complete with fake doors and windows. They minted their own highly standardized gold, silver, and bronze coins, projecting their economic supremacy across continents. But by the 8th century CE, this global superpower simply vanished from the world stage. Their bustling international port of Adulis was completely abandoned to the encroaching sand. The grand capital city of Aksum was evacuated. The imperial population turned their backs on the Red Sea, retreating deep into the isolated, impenetrable mountains of the southern Ethiopian highlands, quietly dissolving into a fragmented agrarian society. Historical texts often blame the explosive rise of the Islamic caliphates, which supposedly blockaded their trade routes. But economic competition does not force an empire to abandon its ancestral homeland. The executioner of the Aksumite Empire was an insidious, self-inflicted ecological apocalypse, amplified by the relentless mechanics of global climate change. To understand the death of Aksum, one must look at the fragile, high-altitude ecosystem upon which it was built. The Ethiopian highlands are a geological marvel, characterized by steep, dramatic topography and incredibly rich volcanic soil. But survival in this environment requires a delicate balance. For centuries, the Aksumites maintained this balance, utilizing brilliant terraced farming to feed their growing population. However, as their empire expanded, their hunger for natural resources became insatiable. Aksum was an advanced Iron Age society, and maintaining a massive military required forging endless amounts of steel weaponry. Furthermore, minting millions of metallic coins and constructing vast stone monuments demanded staggering amounts of thermal energy. In the ancient world, there was only one way to generate that kind of industrial heat: charcoal. To fuel their glittering, wealthy society, the Aksumites began to systematically clear cut the ancient, deep rooted highland forests. Over a few centuries, the lush, forested mountainsides surrounding their great cities were stripped completely bare. The earth is incredibly unforgiving to those who strip it of its protective armor. Trees and deep-rooted vegetation act as the physical anchor for the soil, especially in steep, mountainous terrain. Without the canopy to break the kinetic impact of falling rain, and without the intricate root systems to hold the earth together, the highlands were left totally defenseless. When the predictable, violent summer monsoons arrived, the water no longer soaked gently into the forested earth to replenish the aquifers. Instead, it sheeted off the baked bare rock. This triggered catastrophic, widespread soil erosion. Millions of tons of dark, rich, life-giving topsoil, which had taken the planet tens of thousands of years to naturally generate, were violently scoured from the mountain slopes in a matter of decades. The agricultural foundation of the empire was literally washed down the ravines and flushed into the Red Sea, leaving behind a scarred, barren landscape of exposed bedrock that could not grow enough food to sustain a fraction of their population. As if the self-inflicted ecological devastation were not enough, the Earth's atmospheric engine underwent a massive shift. Paleoclimatic data, extracted from deep lake sediment cores and stalagmites in the region, reveals that around the 7th century CE, the global climate cooled. This cooling violently altered the behavior of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, the massive atmospheric belt that dictates tropical rainfall. The ITCZ shifted southward, causing the reliable monsoon rains that the Horn of Africa depended on to drastically weaken. The Exumites were suddenly trapped in a lethal, inescapable bind. They were hit by a severe, multi-generational megadrought, and the little rain that did fall was useless because they had already washed away all their fertile soil. Starvation rippled through the capital. Without food, the massive labor forces required to carve the giant obelisks dissolved. The imperial economy, entirely dependent on agricultural surplus to support its specialized artisans and merchants, completely collapsed. The great empire of Aksum literally burned its own future to the ground to fuel its temporary wealth. Facing total starvation in a barren, rocky wasteland of their own making, the survivors had no choice but to abandon their magnificent stone monuments. They fled southward, seeking higher, wetter ground, leaving the ghosts of their empire behind in the dust. 9. The Anasazi, ancestral Puebloans. The wrath of the megadrought hidden in the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of the American Southwest, suspended halfway up sheer vertical canyon walls, are the ghost cities of the ancestral Puebloans, historically known as the Anasazi. Long before European explorers set foot in North America, these master engineers commanded the high deserts of the Four Corners region. Their architectural achievements are staggering. In places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, they constructed massive multi-story stone complexes known as pueblos, some containing hundreds of rooms and holding thousands of people. They built perfectly circular ceremonial kivas, engineered complex astronomical alignments into their walls, and constructed an astonishing network of linear roads stretching across the desert. They did all of this without metal tools, without beasts of burden, and without the wheel. For centuries, they thrived in a beautiful but incredibly hostile environment, mastering dryland farming to coax maize, beans, and squash out of the arid soil. But by the end of the 13th century, this vibrant civilization abruptly pulled the plug on its own existence. They did not simply decline, they meticulously packed up their most valuable possessions, deliberately sealed the doors and windows of their magnificent cliff dwellings with stone and mortar, and walked away from centuries of architectural triumph. They vanished, leaving pristine cities hanging silently in the rock. For generations, historians searched for a conquering army to explain this mass exodus, but the Anasazi were not evicted by a foreign invader. They were violently evicted by the atmosphere. The key to unlocking the mystery of their disappearance was not found in written text, but hidden inside the microscopic cellular structure of ancient wood. The American Southwest is a pioneer region for dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings. Because the environment is so dry, wooden beams used to construct the pueblos have been perfectly preserved for 1,000 years. By analyzing these tree rings, paleoclimatologists can read the exact precipitation levels of the ancient world year by year. Wide rings mean heavy rain. Tight, microscopic rings mean drought. When scientists looked at the rings from the late 13th century, they found a terrifying, suffocating anomaly. Starting around the year 1276 CE, the rings almost entirely disappear. The planet was undergoing a massive climate shift known as the medieval climate anomaly. Deep in the Pacific Ocean, shifting currents and sustained cooler surface temperatures, an extreme, prolonged La Nina effect, violently altered the jet stream over North America. The winter storms that normally brought vital snowpack to the Rocky Mountains were pushed far to the north. The summer monsoons simply failed to materialize. The Anasazi were slammed by a mega drought, a catastrophic, unrelenting dry spell that lasted for nearly 30 agonizing years. In a fragile desert ecosystem, a mega drought is an absolute death sentence. The hydrology of the Four Corners region completely collapsed. The water table plummeted rapidly, dropping far below the root systems of the Anasazi crops. The vibrant arroyos and streams that watered their fields turned to blowing dust. But the climate was only half of the equation. The Anasazi had unknowingly pushed their ecosystem to a terrifying tipping point. Decades of booming population had forced them to aggressively deforest the surrounding mesas for firewood and construction timber. Without the trees to retain soil moisture, the arid land baked under the relentless sun. When the rain finally stopped completely, there was no ecological buffer left. The societal collapse was brutally fast and unimaginably violent. The Anasazi religion and political hierarchy were deeply intertwined with the natural world. Their priests were believed to have the power to call the rain. When the skies remained clear year after year, faith in the social order disintegrated. Archaeological evidence from the final decades of the Anasazi reveals a society descending into a horrific, desperate battle for survival. The very architecture of their cities reflects absolute terror. They stopped building in the open valleys and began constructing heavily fortified, highly defensible cliff dwellings, pulling up their wooden ladders at night to protect their dwindling food supplies. Skeletal remains from this period show extreme trauma, broken bones, and even grim evidence of starvation-induced cannibalism. It was a brutal war over the last drops of water and the last kernels of corn. Ultimately, no amount of engineering or warfare could defeat a changing planet. The environment had become fundamentally incompatible with human survival on an urban scale. Facing total extinction, the survivors made the agonizing decision to abandon their ancestral homeland. They descended from the cliffs, leaving their great stone cities to the ravens and the wind, and embarked on a massive, permanent migration south and east toward the Rio Grande and the Hopi Mesas, where permanent water sources still flowed. The Anasazi did not disappear from the earth, but their empire was shattered by the sky, forced to surrender to the unrelenting wrath of a 30-year drought. 10. The Angkor megacity, Khmer Empire, the paradox of water. Deep within the dense, suffocating jungles of Southeast Asia lies the skeletal remains of the largest pre-industrial city in the history of the world. Today, millions of tourists know it for its undisputed crown jewel, the breathtaking five-towered temple of Angkor Wat. But Angkor Wat was merely the religious epicenter of a sprawling, unimaginable urban leviathan. At its zenith in the 12th century, the megacity of Angkor, the thumping heart of the mighty Khmer Empire, spanned over a staggering 1,000 square kilometers. It commanded a population of roughly 1 million people at a time when London was a muddy, chaotic town of barely 30,000. Angkor was not merely a city, it was an apex-level hydraulic machine. The Khmer Empire conquered the unpredictable, violent Asian monsoon by engineering their environment on a planetary scale. They literally terraformed the Earth to build a staggering network of moats, canals, and colossal, perfectly rectangular reservoirs known as barrays. The West Barray alone was an artificial lake 8 kilometers long and over 2 kilometers wide, holding billions of gallons of water, built entirely by human hands without a single drop of mortar. It was so impossibly massive that its footprint is still clearly visible from the International Space Station today. This intricate water management system allowed the Khmer to meticulously control devastating floods, survive brutal dry seasons, and harvest multiple crops of rice a single year. It was a masterpiece of gravity and fluid dynamics that fueled their massive population and allowed them to build an empire out of solid stone. Yet, by the 15th century, the beating heart of the Khmer Empire simply stopped. The sprawling metropolis was completely abandoned. The massive sandstone temples were surrendered to the jungle, slowly crushed by the relentless, python-like roots of strangler fig and silk cotton trees. The vast population seemingly vanished, retreating southward toward the coast, leaving their hydraulic masterpiece to rot. For centuries, historians blamed a devastating military sack by the neighboring kingdom of Ayutthaya. But a city of 1 million people does not simply evaporate into the jungle because it loses a single battle or its political elite are overthrown. The true executioner of Angkor was the very element that birthed it: water. The violent fate of the Khmer Empire was written in the microscopic rings of ancient Fujian cypress trees in neighboring Vietnam and deep inside the stalagmites of regional caves. By reading these paleoclimatic records, Earth scientists discovered that the 14th and 15th centuries were a period of apocalyptic climate chaos across Southeast Asia. The Earth was transitioning from the medieval warm period into the Little Ice Age, and this global temperature shift severely fractured the delicate mechanics of the Asian monsoon cycle. Angkor was subjected to a terrifying, two-pronged environmental attack. First came the mega droughts. The predictable, life-giving monsoons simply failed to arrive, not just for a single season, but for decades at a time. The colossal barrays began to evaporate into cracked mud. Angkor's hydraulic network was an incredibly rigid, interconnected machine reliant on continuous, precisely calculated water pressure. When the water table plummeted, the city's complex infrastructure seized up entirely. Canals choked with silt and overgrown vegetation, the massive rice surpluses required to feed 1 million mouths rapidly vanished, triggering widespread famine. But a drought alone did not break the empire. The fatal blow came when the climate violently swung in the exact opposite direction. Following decades of crippling, bone dry conditions, the shifting atmosphere suddenly unleashed unprecedented, apocalyptic mega monsoons. Torrential, relentless rains pounded the region. Millions of gallons of water violently surged toward a city that was totally unprepared. Because the canals and spillways had dried out and choked with hardened sediment during the long drought, the water had nowhere to safely go. The kinetic energy of the floodwaters was unstoppable. The violent surges completely overwhelmed the ancient earthen dams, tearing massive, irreparable holes in the infrastructure. In a destructive geological process known as gullying, the raging waters ripped through the loose, sandy soil, carving deep, canyon like trenches that bypassed the city's intricate distribution network entirely. The hydraulic machine was literally torn apart from the inside out. Stone bridges collapsed, reservoirs burst, and the carefully controlled agricultural zones were violently swept away in a torrent of mud. The Khmer engineers, once the undisputed masters of water, found themselves trapped in an unwinnable war against a rapidly oscillating planet. Their infrastructure was too massive, too complex, and too deeply entrenched in the earth to be quickly modified or repaired. They had built a perfect machine for a predictable, stable climate. But when the Earth changed the rules, their greatest engineering asset became a fatal trap. Faced with a ruined landscape that wildly alternated between baking desert and violent flood zone, the population of Angkor collapsed under the weight of starvation and infrastructural ruin. They packed up and walked away, completely abandoning the greatest hydraulic city in human history. The colossal stone temples remained, silent and empty, as Mother Nature moved in to swallow the pride of the Khmer, proving once again that no empire, no matter how brilliantly engineered, can outlast the violent, shifting rhythms of the earth.